Welcome to NewYorkBIO's Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week, we're talking vaccines with Chris Earl, who has been a high-level advisor to the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, Merck Ventures, and the previous CEO of BioVentures for Global Health.
Good morning. Welcome to NewYorkBIO's Virtual Breakfast, which we're holding each Tuesday. My name is Jennifer Hawkes Bland, and I'm the CEO at NewYorkBIO. We're thrilled you're with us today. Today, it's a topic that you can literally not open your phone to see a news article about, or if you picked up an old-fashioned paper, which some people still do, I hear, read an article about. We have the very knowledgeable Chris Earl with us to talk about vaccine development, in particular coronavirus vaccine development today. So thank you all for joining us, and thanks to our friends at Goodwin, the law firm, for sponsoring our breakfast series. I'm going to kick it over to you, Derek, and let you introduce our guest. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Jennifer. Well, good morning, Chris. We have such a great benefit to have you here. You've got a fantastic background between IAVI, BioVentures for Global Health, Merck, and investor perspective. Before we kick things off, do you want to give people a little sense of where you came from and how you got where you are?
Yes, there in 30 seconds. I was originally trained as a molecular biologist, but I've spent most of my career in the venture business, either as an investor or running entrepreneurial companies. I've also had the really good fortune of working in the global public health arena, both as a CEO at BioVentures for Global Health, which was the spin-out from Bio that was dedicated to trying to drive biotech R&D into the treatments, developing new treatments for neglected tropical diseases. So, and also had the good fortune 2 years ago to spend a year working as a senior advisor at IAVI, the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, which, as you know, is the lead organization developing, hopefully developing an AIDS vaccine, but also has branched out into a number of different areas, and indeed is now working very closely with Merck on a COVID vaccine. So and also I spent 6 or 7 years working with the folks at Merck, helping build their corporate venture efforts, but at the same time got instilled with the Merck kind of ethos, and it was at the time that they were also developing the Ebola vaccine, which I think is informing a lot of what they're doing now with COVID.
Well, this was one of the real reasons we wanted to push you to have you on, just because the diversity of perspectives is tremendous here. And if you think about it, there are a lot of parallels between what people are trying to do with a COVID vaccine and really global health, right? How can you actually spread this across the globe to everyone and really protect everyone and keep everyone safe as things flare up? And there's probably parallels to some of those other efforts in what we're seeing now, albeit on a largely accelerated timescale.
Well, I think you're right, Derek. There's now really a chance for feedback between the entrepreneurial world of biotechnology and the global public health arena, and in a couple of different ways. One is that from the of the past 20 years, you've seen that the mission has been to develop medical interventions that are capable of being distributed to a large number of people, that are highly effective. And that's something that we're going to need for any successful effort to develop vaccines for the COVID. Realistically, and this is just quoting from Bill Gates, 7 billion doses or 7 billion effective doses are going to have to be distributed around the world because, as he has said, and as has George Daly, the Dean of Harvard Medical School, said, none of us is safe until all of us are safe. And we've seen how tamp down the virus as soon as they kind of open up to other areas that may not have done such a good job, bang, they've got hotspots all over again. So I think that is the logistical challenge, but it's one that organizations like Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and UNICEF, WHO, Gates Foundation, PATH have been trying to master for years. And the scale is really, extraordinary. I mean, in the US, we have, how many kids get inoculated with, let's say, childhood vaccines every year? A few to several million. How many people need to get vaccinated with a coronavirus vaccine? 300 million, so plus or minus. So that's, it's kind of the scale that things need to be done. I think the other aspect of this is, we maybe doesn't get discussed as much, is the testing aspect. Because right now we have a real problem with testing, which is that the whole idea of having rapid point of care testing is kind of essential to being able to identify people who could potentially be spreading the virus in real time so that they can get isolated. And we really don't have that capacity right now. When you wait 7 days for a test, you're getting a historical snapshot, but you're not doing anything to control a person's contagion. So again, I think in the global health arena, the idea of coming up with very fast point of care, sufficiently sensitive, not sensitive down to 30 cycles of PCR, but sufficiently sensitive and deployable has been something that again the global health arena has been working on very, very hard, and something we need now, because our currently it seems to plateau around 750,000 tests a day across the US, which sounds okay, but if you were trying to keep schools safe and you wanted to test kids every couple of days, and you've got 56 million K-12 students in the US, you see the kinds, you're talking about orders of magnitude in terms of where we need to get to.
Well, even here in New York, early on, people were only getting tested if they felt symptomatic, right? So then at least you could tell them, if you're symptomatic or you're feeling bad, isolate until you get the results.
Right.
Now it's expanded, right? So people are getting tested to go on their August vacations, or they've come back from an August vacation or whatever, and they're now getting tested. I got tested, and my 9-year-old did yesterday, and we're hearing that it could be up to a week now to get test results. And
right.
if I just happen to have it, but I'm totally asymptomatic, then I don't know to isolate. So then I've infected whoever I might have been in contact with.
Exactly. So that's something that I think also is, along with the vaccines, if we're talking about, maybe nearer term interventions or improvements, but it's not like everybody isn't trying. I mean, LabCorp and Quest are, they've announced we're at our limit of our capacity. This wasn't anything we could have anticipated, and they're adding capacity as quickly as they can. But again, the problem with a lot of this, it takes time. One of the things I talked to Derek, to you, and Jennifer about before we got started here was, before we get into all the a lot of the problems and the delays and the things that are causing, making this not as quick as we'd all like, to maybe talk about some of the good news.
Because we have learned a couple of things, right? With all of the vaccine development efforts over the years, we've actually gotten pretty good at a number of things. Yes.
Well, that's right, and so I think there are a couple of things. First of all, this has really been a challenge to the whole biopharmaceutical industry. It's like, okay, guys, you've been telling us you're wonderful for years. Okay, show us. And you've seen dozens and dozens of companies drop their tools and get to work on COVID. And so we have so many different avenues under in R&D right now that it's extraordinary. So that's number one. Number two is that the technology is at a stage where we can actually imagine some of these efforts being successful. And we didn't just start working on nucleic acid based vaccines or adenoviral vectors, last week. This has been going on for decades. And I don't know if you all remember companies like Apollon and Vical that started in the 1990s. Apollon was a spin out from Centocor, and they were going to be developing nucleic acid based vaccines, and that it's taken all that time to get it to the point where it actually works. And the analogy I like to bring up is the Apple Newton versus the first iPhone. The Newton was around in the late 80s and early 90s, and the idea was there. The same as with the nucleic acid vaccines. This should work. This is a great idea and it should work. But all of the technology, the knowledge, the different types of science that had to be developed, they weren't there in the mid 90s, but they're there today. And maybe for some of these new interventions that are being worked on for COVID, we have the opportunity to, we're lucky in that respect that these technologies have finally evolved to the point where they can be realistically turned into products. I think the other thing is that much as the, many aspects of the coronavirus response by the government have been criticized, one thing they have done is they've taken the risk out of the scale up. Typically with a vaccine, the development time, the fastest development time of all is like 4 or 5 years. And that's, running full tilt and where everything works. And so obviously that's not acceptable in the current circumstance. One of the things that really slows things down is how long it takes to, or how conservative companies are legitimately before they start scaling up manufacture. And because most vaccine facilities are purpose-built and they're very, very expensive, companies not likely to want to scale up like that until they're really sure they've got an approved or approvable vaccine that is also merchantable. And in this case, government's basically just taken that risk off the table and said, we will just pay for it. And we know we're going to pay for things that don't work and get scuttled, but we're going to pay for the candidates that have lead potential. And, we'll just pay for the scale up. And we recognize that we're absorbing all that risk. And that was really essential to accelerating this process.
Well, I think the folks at BARDA have done a good job, and over the years they've been pretty aggressive with manufacturing technologies, and it's slightly under-recognized, but they stepped in really early and, like you said, took some of that right off the table. The other one, of course, is Bill Gates, who has basically said he's going to take the top 5 and help cover manufacturing. So the numbers are very, very large, and we may still not be out of the woods because there are, not to get ahead of ourselves, but there's looming challenges with things like, is there enough glass in the world to make the vials that we're going to fill and finish? But you're right, it's one of the things where the companies usually move reasonably slowly and deliberately, and now it's well, what if we made that cost go away? Right. Now how fast could you go?
And then it gets capacity, right? I mean, similar to what we're experiencing with the turnaround of the PCR diagnostics, just getting all of the equipment and the ingredients and everything else and personnel. I mean, and getting, sometimes you have an expert in New York who needs to be in San Diego. That actually now is a problem. But nonetheless, I mean, look, we're not in a position to necessarily to second guess. I mean, AstraZeneca said they expect to have 400 million doses of their vaccine ready by the end of the year. Yeah, that is insanely awesome. So
I think most people are coming up with all of the people who have said they're committing to doses by the end of the year are in the hundreds of millions. Right. And you brought this up before, and we've seen this a little bit in the public press, but the biotech industry and the biopharma industry at large may not have the best public perception, but I would argue that in this crisis, the entire industry has stepped up and shown the best of what it can be. We really are seeing, I think, a development environment where everyone looks at the experience that they've built on and said, okay, how fast can we go? And how fast can we go? And how well can we put together, 30,000, person phase 3 trials? And how well can we actually do what we do on an accelerated timescale? And, it would appear that in a lot of these cases that, people are genuinely just going faster. I don't believe anyone is cutting corners. It's not like we're seeing underpowered trials. It'll be interesting if we have multiple phase 3 trials recruiting at the same time, if people are able to get the diversity of patients that they need in that scale. So that kind of looks like the mountain in front of us, right? Can people get their trials enrolled, get the data that they want, and think about how to interpret that data on a pretty rapid timescale? Because usually, you have a much more forgiving timescale for accepting and analyzing data. Even if you look at the planned timeline of these trials, Moderna's trial technically doesn't read out until 2022. Right. So
there were obviously going to be interim assessments along the way. I think sadly in the US right now, you have areas with test positivity rates that, and a lot of them, so that you've probably got a pretty good diversity of sites where you could enroll patients. But there's some things that, if you think about it, just can't be compressed. And one of those is just, you need a certain amount of time if you're doing a placebo-controlled protection trial, where you can't obviously be doing a challenge, is to, you have to wait for people to get sick and, and then count them. So, what's the shortest amount of time that you can get some reasonable assessment of that? And particularly if the vaccine isn't at the 100% protection level, right? One of the ways that the Ebola vaccine was able to read out as quickly as it did was that its protection level was like 97.5%. So basically everybody got the vaccine, stayed healthy, and you could have a fairly small cohort and get a really strong signal. Some of these vaccines, I mean, in many cases, like the flu vaccine this year, what is it, or this past year was maybe 50% protective. Right. If your vaccine is in that range, then you're going to need a longer readout to really get statistically significant data.
Yeah.
And surely as soon as you get that kind of data, there will be, emergency use authorizations out of the FDA for some of these vaccines. You still will be only at the early stages of determining durability, like how long does the effect last? And however, those, for people on the front lines who are, at risk of exposure every day, that's going to be less of a concern and more a sense of let's get as protected as we can as quickly as we can.
Yeah. And
so how do people,
don't you think? I mean,
I was gonna say the tolerability for repeat dosing will be greater there.
Yeah.
If
so
you need
how do people tend to think about vaccine effectiveness with limited data, right? What are some of the ways that people are looking at this now? Because anything we have in terms of efficacy estimates are now by definition a guess, right? So what kind of things go into determining whether we think something is going to be effective or at what level?
Well, so that's a complicated question, and it's certain aspects that are definitely above my pay grade and my scientific firsthand knowledge. But let's just think about it conceptually, right? So for certain vaccines, you have correlates of immunity, correlates of protection, where if you see a certain level of immune response, that is highly correlated with protection. So,
and by immune response, you mean things like neutralizing antibodies, correct?
Yeah, typically it would be neutralizing antibodies. So I think it's, if I'm, probably one of our guests can correct me, but I think with a flu vaccine, if you get a certain antibody titer with a vaccine across a number of individuals, yeah, you're pretty much sure that it works, at least against that strain. We just haven't had the time yet to figure out what those correlates are. And as I saw one article where I think it was one of the experts in this area was quoted as saying that the immune responses of recovered COVID patients are all over the map. Some of them have high antibody titers, some of them have low. Some have T-cell responses one kind, some have others. So, this is in some ways, a diabolical virus that it may really make any kind of sort of surrogate marker be much more difficult to obtain. Time obviously will tell. Now, so what's the good news? The good news is that the lead vaccines, in the reports that we've seen, which are hard to compare because they use different measures in each case, but they all look like they've generated strong immune responses, in some cases strong neutralizing antibody responses in the phase 1 trials. Also, in primate trials, you've seen protection against virus challenge. None of those are highly predictive. You're going to see in a phase 3 trial necessarily, but they're certainly very encouraging, right? And again, this is purely Chris Earl's opinion, and there are probably people on the show who watching the show who can give us more detail on that. But I think if you just look at it logically, that seems to be one of the things that we should really be encouraged by.
Well, famously, over the weekend, there was a scientist that posted the fact that we should skip all the phase 3 trials and start giving the vaccine to everyone. And the community vociferously responded with, "No, we shouldn't." And here's all the reasons that you run phase 3 trials. He did. And yesterday he published the "I was wrong and here's why" article in Forbes. So
good for him, right? Good for him. Yeah.
It was, he made a mistake on Friday and thankfully said he was wrong on Monday, and everybody said, there you go, good job. Nice to admit that you were wrong.
Yeah, Laurie, if you follow Laurie Garrett's Twitter feed, she was mildly apoplectic about that article.
It's interesting. There were a couple of very, very educational and very well thought out threads of here's the reason we run large scale phase 3 trials when developing vaccines, because you have, events that come up in a couple of hundred people that, are probably amplified when you extend that to 30,000. And there's other things that won't come up in that population that you would miss.
Well, so one of the reasons, Derek, that I think that we have to, from the point of view of how the industry communicates with the public at large, is those rationales are often hard to communicate to the general public, because they, the complexities of how you have to do this, particularly when there's so many people that are suffering severe disease and dying. You're like, why you're somehow holding out on us is the implication. Like, you've got this, you think it works, how come we can't have it today? And obviously this, was a huge issue back in the early stages of the AIDS crisis. And so making those arguments have to be made, I think, over and over again. I mean, I've seen posts on Facebook where they say, well, look, the Russians have this vaccine they're dosing their whole government with next week. Are the Ruskies, smarter than we are? What's holding, is there some, is this some evil plot, to raise prices or something like that? And
and it's also exacerbated today because of the broad economic impacts, right, that we're seeing because of coronavirus shutdown. So I think there may be swaths of the country that are I'm willing to take that risk if it can get us back to work and earning a living and that sort of thing, which I think is not something we talk about if it's a small population with a serious, medical condition. It's just a very different conversation.
Yeah. Have you seen any effective explanations of that to the general public? Do you guys see that argument being made?
I mean, I think the thing that I see, it's interesting because I see a lot more of the companies and the developers posting preprints online. I think you can only do so much in terms of the layers of communication to the general public when you're talking about scientific results. So I think there's probably always going to be a gap there. I think the things that we have seen are either folks like Ken Frazier or Albert Bourla who have, been very measured in how they're responding to things. They stress both patients and have a grasp of the size of the challenge that they're dealing with. So I think anytime you have a challenge like this, there are going to be certain leaders who are really good at giving that level of communication. When there is a gap where, Albert Bourla is not going to talk about complexities of T cell responses when talking to a broad general audience because they're going to miss it. But
Yeah.
I think in general, most of the people at, the leading companies have been able to toe that line pretty well. And I think for the scientific community, there has been a flood of, I think people have been pretty good at posting publishable results pretty quickly and having those disseminated into the scientific community. I think one of the big advantages here is the growth of sites like bioRxiv and medRxiv. Right? The publishing industry in and of themselves have actually gone very, very quickly to get these results to the public, whether they come out of biopharma companies or whether they come out of academia. So there's been a very rapid dissemination of scientific and study information into the general public.
But
Right.
Derek, your answer is just the problem, right? You just spent like 3 minutes talking about scientific data and publishing and how there's a gap. But really what we need is the ability to bumper sticker. And this has long been a challenge in our industry, is the ability to communicate things succinctly and clearly so that the general population understands.
And I think it's going to become more urgent. And here's why. Because we hear a lot of people in, positions of authority, including people who we have a lot of respect for, like Tony Fauci, saying, we could have a vaccine by the end of the year. And so, how is that heard by us? How is that heard by the general public?
Yeah.
So when I hear that, I say, oh, that's good. We could have a vaccine that has gone through the first stage of a phase 3 clinical trial and really seems to be protective in the small number of patients we've been able to analyze so far, and nobody's gotten really sick of the people to whom it's been administered. So, and then it might be at a stage where you could get it in an emergency use authorization for the people most at risk, whether people with underlying conditions, maybe not really old people because they may not have been tested enough in those folks, certainly frontline healthcare workers. But that's not how I think the general public hears that. They say, oh, well, if we just muddle through the autumn, we'll be able to go to the CVS Minute Clinic in January, get our jab, and it'll be good. So that's, I think, and that's where, folks like Ken Frazier and Bill Gates have been, and maybe they are, good communicators, but I'm not sure that they're getting widely disseminated, are saying, temper your expectations because the point at which a vaccine is deemed sufficiently safe and effective to and durable to be distributed broadly across the population is going to take longer. Now, how long, I don't know, but one of the things I actually want to recommend as a source of information for folks on the Zoom call today is the UCSF Grand Rounds, which they put up on the COVID Grand Rounds. They post on YouTube weekly. They're really terrific, and they're really available and understandable to to the general public, as well as being really interesting to scientists. So, and in the most recent Grand Rounds, which was on the vaccines, the moderator asked the panelists, so how long do you think, when is a vaccine going to become generally available to the public? And the earliest, they all kind of said, well, a year from now. And that was, and they sounded kind of like that would be an optimistic goal. So I think if we come to the end of the year and you can't go down to the CVS Minute Clinic, there's going to be some splaining to do. And, I think people need to get prepared for that. That, the way things are now could be the way things are a year from now, maybe longer.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So we had two good questions here related to, yeah, there's the bumper sticker, Jennifer. We had two really good questions relating to this, and the first one is, how are we thinking about protecting our kids if we're testing on people that are all over 18? And the second was from Chris Marshall, who's somebody that knows a thing or two about vaccines, which is what is our expectation for protecting the elderly who are most at risk. So you have these, two ends of the spectrum to think about. How do we think about those things?
Well,
especially the kids, because we can't test the vaccine in kids with the current clinical trial structure that we have.
So there's a couple of different elements to that. And again, this is derivative information. So again, there may be people on the call who have more firsthand knowledge, but there are indications. I don't know that it's, I certainly wouldn't say it's been confirmed, but there are indications that little kids, elementary school kids, don't really get the disease that easily and don't spread it that easily. Mm-hmm. And there are a number of different studies around the globe that, again, are, they're anecdotal, they're not controlled, they're observational and so forth. But where it seems that the elementary school little kids don't, it's not that they don't get it at all, they don't get it as much. But for the teenagers, they seem to be more, more like the adults in the way the vaccine operates with them. Again, a little bit of hand waving. So maybe we'll see how that evolves down. But this is, I guess the other point is this is an evolutionary process. So the first vaccines that hit the market are unlikely to be perfect, which is true in many, many types of vaccines. The first generation is not going to give you everything you want. I mean, if you think about the shingles vaccines, right? Stostrovac, the Merck versus GSK. The GSK vaccine came out, several years after the Merck vaccine, but it has a much higher level of protection and has basically supplanted the Merck vaccine. But nonetheless, a few years ago, the Merck vaccine was all we had. Okay, maybe it's, 60, 70% protective, but I got it, rather that than 100% unprotected. And I think we're just gonna, have to face up to that. What seems, and the interesting thing about the GSK vaccine that may track here is that it is so immunogenic that it works even in old folk, even 80 years and above, because it is so damn immunogenic. Part of the evidence for that, I haven't gotten it yet, but part of the evidence for that is it really, really hurts. It makes you feel like crap. So I guess that doesn't working. But I think something's happening there, right? But
this must work. I feel it.
So we may see an evolution, right, where we, that the older folks, the protection for older folks depends on the development of vaccine that is really, really immunogenic. And definitely some of the people in the mix right now are targeting that as a goal, is to develop something that's, that the immune system just goes like, oh my God, and reacts very strongly to, even in folks whose immune system, and I'm getting into that age group, I'm afraid myself, starts to, kind of just take a break. And so I think what we have to look at this is as an evolutionary process, and that every program that's underway now is going to generate data that informs the other programs. And here, again, I think the commitment to data transparency is really, really important. That, and I think most of the players have committed to that, is being very open about the data and the clinical trials in real time, as much as they can in a placebo-controlled blinded trial. And again, that hopefully will accelerate the point where, you have vaccines that are, great for old people, great for kids, and also can be deployed effectively in resource-poor settings. And one of the things, that's a bit of a conundrum here is that, particularly for going into less developed countries or resource-poor settings, even our own country, is that some of these vaccines, the live vaccines and the nucleic acid vaccine, mRNA vaccines, have to be stored at -80. It's like not in a freezer, not in a refrigerator.
Yep.
Yeah.
-80 conditions. And so transportation becomes, if you're talking about, this deployment, transportation becomes an issue. And look, they managed to get it to work for Ebola, right? So it's not that it can't, and they have very innovative storage containers that they use that can be, run off kerosene and stuff. But obviously, vaccine that can be stored in the refrigerator or, heaven forbid, at room temperature would be a lot easier to distribute than one that's -80. So, all these problems will get solved over time, but it also indicates that we're unlikely to have, magic bullet in the first round.
Especially not for the globe, right?
Especially not for the globe. Especially not for the globe. One of the advantage, I think, again, into the good news category, is that most of the pharma companies that are in the in the first round here have committed to making their products available at affordable or even rock bottom prices throughout the world. And also the Serum Institute of India has jumped into the game. I think their partnership is with AstraZeneca and Oxford to produce their adenovirus-based vaccine. And the Serum Institute of India is the biggest vaccine manufacturer in the world. Most of their products go into the medium income and lower income countries, and they produce 1.5 billion doses of vaccine per year. So the idea of operating at scale for Serum Institute is nothing new. And also they've been really aggressive over the past 10 years in terms of building full-fledged FDA, EMEA qualified manufacturing so that they can sell into any market around the world. So again, good news is that getting Serum Institute into the game and others who have that kind of capacity and are used to going into those settings. And also clearly Gavi and UNICEF, WHO have committed to scaling up so that they can do that as well. And again, they're used to mass vaccination campaigns in very large populations in the global South. So those are all things that, again, may prove really helpful as we try to inoculate unprecedented amounts or numbers of people in the developed world.
And we are seeing lots of collaboration. I think Gilead has licensed remdesivir manufacturing to maybe 17, at least it was 17 back maybe a month ago, different organizations across the globe to manufacture there. So certainly these partnerships, I think, are the only way we'll ever reach capacity, because you have to think too, this is capacity on top of existing vaccine manufacturing. Right. It's not like we're going to stop vaccinating for all of the other conditions which we currently want protection.
Right. At scale up. I mean, that's one of the things, again, in terms of things we have shortages of, we'd all like to be able to get N95 masks, but we can't do that right now. Well, they say, well, why not? Why doesn't 3M just scale up the masks? And well, they have as much as they could, but a small fraction of their N95 masks go into the medical industry. Most of it's in manufacturing, things that generate small particulate dust. So machine shops, manufacturing, mining, stuff like that. And so I don't know how much of their supplies to those industries they've diverted, but just keeping up with the needs of frontline healthcare workers has made it is the best they've been able to do as they scale up. So we need, as you said, we need international cooperation, international involvement, everybody in, so that when you're talking about scaling up by orders of magnitude, it actually becomes possible.
Yeah. Here's a good question we had from the audience. If there are multiple vaccines on the market, how will I know which one is right for me? And does it matter?
Wow. Again, I have, as the old New Yorker cartoon said, Yes, I'm a doctor, but not the kind that can help people. So, but it's a really good question, because people are going to ask their GPs, like, okay, well, there are these different vaccines out there. It's an informational thing, where presenting primary care physicians with the data that differentiates these things. I mean, again, like as with the herpes vaccines, the herpes zoster vaccines, you could give them, doctors could have pretty clear information. Yeah, this one just is a lot more protective,
Yeah.
It's 2 shots. Yes, it hurts more, but it's going to give you better protection. And they could advise that very, very clearly. We're going to need similar kinds of information when these things become available. And I think the bigger question initially is going to be, when the first ones become available to the general public, I think the question people are going to have is, do I take this one or do I wait for the next one?
Yes.
And that one's going to be really, really tough. And it's tough from a public health perspective as well, because once a vaccine becomes available, let's hope and let's assume that it has an efficacy rate, protection rate of greater than 70%. You need, if it's determined that that's the one people should go with, you're going to need to make a strong argument for that. Like, well, why don't I wait for one that's 90% protective? Would they interfere with? People are going to ask, well, if I take one and there's a better one comes along, can I take that one too? Or are they somehow going to interfere with each other? People are going to have those kinds of questions. Again, that's a communications issue that will have to be addressed, but that's, I think, downstream. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah. Well, who answers those questions? I mean, how is it that those questions actually get answered? How as a broad scale population do we think about what vaccine do I get and do I wait? And what kind of communication do you see as being really important as things start to come onto the market?
Well, this is a question that we are going to be struggling with, I think, because of the level of misinformation out there. Yeah. Not only do you have a lot of misinformation, but you also have the anti-vaxxers, and who have already gotten on the bandwagon on this. And the anti-vaxxers really are very effective, because they don't really need to prove their point. All they need to do is create doubt, really. Yes. Yeah. This could be really, really bad for you and your kids. I don't think you want to do it. And it's got mercury in it and all this other stuff. I mean, so the misinformation, the disinformation could really be problematic from a public health perspective, because if you start multiplying the probabilities where you need a certain amount of protection across the population to generate herd immunity, if that's really the goal, I'm not sure it is, but if it were the goal, you say, well, X% of the people are going to be dissuaded by the anti-vaxxers, X% of the people are going to wait for the next one, X% of the people get protected because this vaccine is 70 or 80%. Your numbers start to get smaller as you multiply the decimals, the fractions. And so, again, that could delay the point where the virus gets suppressed across the population. Individuals could be protected, but the population could still be experiencing, breakouts.
Yeah.
Well, and you think about normal vaccine, right? Normal vaccines, most people have no idea who manufactured, particularly in the pediatric setting, I think, because that's whatever wherever the pediatrician chooses to buy. For example, when I worked at GSK, I wanted my kids to get the GSK vaccine. When I worked at Merck, I wanted it to be the Merck vaccine.
Of course.
But most, and I would ask, and the nurses would be like, kind of give me like the weird eye, because I wanted to know who was manufacturing vaccines, but I think most people don't. And I certainly think as the first doses, are deployed, it's going to be availability, capacity, location. I think it's probably less about choice based on what you think about the vaccine and more about how they're deployed based on a government sort of process.
Right. Well, I think in the past, you might have depended on the CDC to give you guidelines along those ways, but unfortunately, whether this is perception or reality, the perception is that CDC has been highly politicized by the by the current administration, and so perhaps that there's been an erosion of trust there to pretty much exactly the time that you would need need the CDC to be viewed as an honest broker. So I do not have an answer for that, because I think you need people who are trusted, and I think this is where, in spite of the the misinformation and the people who are the trolls or whatever, that still people are listening to Tony Fauci, people are listening to Deborah Birx. These are two people who really are trying to deliver the true story, and to the extent their voices can get through, hopefully that that is something that moves the population and gives people some confidence in their expertise. I don't know. Does that make sense to you guys? You're grasping for hope here. Right?
I know. Right.
I think if we think about long tail immunity, we really have, there's a number of factors, and we haven't touched on one of them yet. And we have the efficacy factor, right? Then we have the, how can we get it to as many people as possible? And then we have adherence, right? Because we may be talking about, 2 doses versus 1 dose in some of these vaccines. And a lot of the 2-dose vaccines, we've seen the greater immunity really comes from the boost that you get a month after. But now you have another logistical problem of you don't only have to vaccinate people, you have to do it twice, right? So now you have an adherence challenge in addition to all of the other challenges of getting it broadly distributed.
Right. Well, then it comes down to personal motivation, and I don't know. For something to be deadly, that's a pretty good motivator. You hope that, at least in the developed world setting, that is a a strong inducement to go and get your second shot. And also, with a lot of the information technology we have, once somebody gets their first dose, you can pester them mercilessly until they get their booster. Right? I mean, that they would have to, ideally you would have people agree to get a text message every 6 hours until they get show up for the booster shot. And the resource poor settings is more difficult, because in many areas, and this has been important for the development of a number of different vaccines that go into those settings, is to try to drive it down to a single dose. And I think because sometimes you just don't have records, you can't find people, they're mobile, in a huge shanty town, there's no addresses, how do you find people again? Maybe by their cell phones, but it is a huge challenge. And this is one of the issues with the HPV vaccine, right, with Gardasil, tremendous effort to try, can we get this down to 1 dose? And so far, I believe it's gotten down to, you can get it down to 2 doses, right? But one has so far, it looks like you still need the second dose. So I think yes, ideally you'd want it to be single dose, and sometimes Mother Nature doesn't just give you that opportunity. I do think that when you look at the target product profiles that have been developed by some of the companies that are developing vaccines, having a single dose is high on the list, and is part of how they're engineering their antibodies, engineering their vaccines, is to have a single dose, highly immunogenic agent that you can use in those settings, and also could be good for old people.
Yeah. It's funny. So we have another half question, half statement. So Cindy Green, who was on NewYorkBIO's board for many years and has spent a long time in vaccines BD across Pfizer, has said, there's probably, we're not sure if we're going to have a lot of choice, because it may be availability of certain things at different centers. But he also brings up the great point that we're not even sure if we're able to get it again once we have it. It comes back to this point, we don't really know the correlates of long-term immunity here. So it's really a challenge of, as we keep moving forward and adding more information, can we get smarter and adapt the way that we are thinking about who gets what vaccines and how we're acting as a society?
Right.
And, Yeah, go ahead. I mean, it goes back to your testing question before. How can we get better information distributed to a much wider set of the population so that we can make educated decisions and proceed safely? Because we're really talking about long tail immunity, whether it's January, whether it's this time next year. We're really talking about how can we bring the immunity of the population up.
Right. Well, I think there are the two indicators that maybe give us a little bit of hope on this front. And Cindy, you raised one issue, which is it possible to get it twice? You can get anything twice. I mean, I actually think I got chickenpox twice, which seems amazing as a kid, but it's not supposed to happen. My mother told me I did. Anyhow, but however, if it were possible to get it twice, you would probably have more reports that had happened. And so far, again, I'm taking this straight from the UCSF grand rounds. There have not been any confirmed reports of people getting it twice. And so it's possible that people thought they were getting it twice because they never really cleared it the first time. But what you would need to have had is, PCR tests taken at the time points along the way, probably, antibody tests done at the same time, where you show that somebody completely, they cleared the virus, they were healthy again, and then they got it again. And we haven't seen that. So I think that there's reason to be hopeful that getting it, and again, even though the immune responses seem to be very variable, that whatever your immune system does to knock the virus down creates some sort of persistence. And I think that we can be fairly, fairly comfortable, maybe is the word, that the reports that antibody titers go down once people have cleared the infection, yeah, but that's normal, right? I mean, Immunology 101 says that after an infection, in many cases, if not most cases, the antibody titers decline over time because they're not being produced anymore, they're not needed. But you have robust reservoir of memory B cells that will protect you going forward and mount a very quick and even more protective immune response if you get reinfected. So I guess, the number of reports have said, oh, we really need to worry about the fact that antibody titers are declining. And it seems to me that that's not something we need to worry about. But the hopeful thing is that people seem not to be getting it twice. Again, needs to be confirmed. And second, that when the vaccines have been introduced into in the phase 1 trials, that they have seen strong titers of neutralizing antibodies, which gives you also hope that these things are going to be protective and potentially even durable. So this is where Derek, am I doing an okay job of balancing the doom and gloom with the the hopeful stuff?
I think so. I mean, one of the things that we come back to is that I think if you think about where we are now, there are people and companies that have spent decades establishing, bona fide expertise in vaccine development. I think we have a very large swath of the industry that, by and large, understands the ins and outs of how to develop a vaccine. I think I don't think this is the Wild West of development. I think there are people that are proceeding really intelligently. And I think that community kind of knows what it can do and knows what it's good, and also knows what it can't do, right? So if there's one thing that I've been really both impressed by and really have a lot of confidence in, is that this section of the biopharma community has really stepped up to bat, and I think put their best foot forward in terms of trying to develop a broad scale solution that can help everybody. I mean, you used the Ken Frazier quote earlier that we're not safe until none of us are safe until all of us are safe, right? And you have just broadly, you have companies that are developing a vaccine at risk, You have organizations that are trying to de-risk the biggest pieces of the process with funding manufacturing, funding scale up. So really, I think we can't immediately wave away the unknowns, but from what I've seen, I think there are a lot of things to have confidence in, that we have a lot of very good people trying to, use their expertise in the best way possible to provide a broad scale solution for the entire world. So I think the doom and gloom stuff is hard because the details are hard. But I think broadly, if you look at the response that we've had as an industry, I think there's a lot to be proud of and a lot to be said for the people that, have really been going 24 hours a day for the last however many months. We have to remember that we learned of this in January, right? And now it's 6 months later, 7 months later, and we have things entering phase 3 trials.
Yeah,
That's unprecedented.
it's amazing. Yeah, totally unprecedented. So yes, and that's the folks in the industry have been working around the clock on this and have moved this the way they have, and to get the government moving with them and to get the kind of funding we've seen is is really extraordinary. So I think they deserve an enormous amount of credit, and of course I think we always have to recognize the frontline healthcare providers who are taking the risks every day of treating the patients, and who with the tools that we have today have done an amazing job of improving outcomes for patients, just by using basic medical technologies that we have at hand, learning how this virus affects people, learning what you need to do to improve people's respiratory function and cardiac function, really understanding how this disease hurts people when you don't have, really a satisfactory armamentarium of therapeutics. You really just have basic medical interventions. And you see in places where they're doing that, they have, you have a little can you say that word for me? Dexamethasone and remdesivir. But, we don't have, we don't have like a Tamiflu type drug yet that can take as a pill that really reduces symptoms early on. Hopefully we'll have that in another year or two. But, there's a number of projects underway, but we have to recognize that the death rates, case fatality rates have really dropped because, what people on the front lines have discovered. So recognize them. I know we're coming to an end. A couple of things that I see an anonymous attendee. Well, that's not fair. You should say who you are. Wants my contact info. It's easy. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me. You can send me a message through LinkedIn if you want to do that.
Okay.
I also want to recognize any friends or family who've joined in and put up with me for the past hour. Thank you. I'm sure I'll get the reviews by text and email immediately after this.
Yeah, it's the 10 o'clock phone call after the 9 o'clock webinar.
Yeah.
Well, listen, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I mean, this is something that I think a lot of people are discussing every single day, and there's new news, there's new information every day, and I think this is one of the topics that is front and center in everyone's mind, because really we're thinking of it as you think of vaccines as probably the biggest key towards broad scale immunity and towards defeating the virus. So, thank you so much for joining us today. You really bring a great perspective and a great background on all this. So Jennifer, I will kick it over to you to close this out.
Yeah, we are right on time, everyone. Thank you so much, Chris. Very valuable information and a very, very helpful discussion for our audience. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to Goodwin for being our sponsor, and we will see you next week. All right, have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on NewYorkBIO, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.